You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
Hi, I'm Dr. Pamela Kreiser, and welcome back to NCR 507, Research Design and Interpretation. Today we're going to continue our exploration of foundations of research. And of course, that means that we have to talk about some very fundamental concepts. Now, in our previous episode, we did lay some of the groundwork. Today we're going to get more specific. As we talk about the foundations of research, we're going to talk about three different areas today. The first is to talk about independent and dependent variables. The next is to talk about ethics and human subjects and the IRB. And then finally, we'll end our conversation talking about hypotheses and research questions. And as we put all of those together, then we'll see them put into practice in current day research with an interview that I have on Skype. So let's get started by talking about the first area, which is independent variables and dependent variables. We want to start our discussion talking about those very important variables because we have to understand them to understand most of research. Now, when we talk about independent and dependent variables, we want to talk about them in two different contexts. One is in the area of difference testing, and the other is the area of relationship testing. So let's get started. Today we are going to talk about independent and dependent variables. The focus will be on understanding how these operate in research and also being able to identify these variables in research projects. To keep it simple, we will use examples that have just one independent variable and one dependent variable. And even though sometimes research projects involve many different kinds of variables. Let's start with dependent variables. In research, the dependent variable is highly important because this is the variable the researcher is trying to explain or predict. Often, dependent variables are associated with the purpose of the study. The dependent variable is very often the entire focus of the research project. The dependent variable is thought to depend upon or be influenced by other variables in the study. The researcher measures the changes on the dependent variable because of this dependency. In research, the independent variable is also important because this is the variable the researcher manipulates. This is the variable that does the influencing. Some examples will help us understand these two variables. Let's start by looking at examples of how the independent and dependent variable operate in difference testing. Let's say we are conducting a study with the following two-tailed hypothesis. Adults and children will differ significantly in the total number of calories they consume per day. By definition, we know that a hypothesis expresses the researcher's prediction about the relationship between the independent and dependent variable. So we can identify the presence of each variable by looking at the hypothesis. We see, by looking at the hypothesis, the dependent variable is total calorie consumption per day. The independent variable is the age group, and we have two categories within that variable, adults and children. This is a two-tailed hypothesis because of the word differ. And this indicates the researcher's belief that the groups will be significantly different. But it doesn't specify which group will be higher or lower. In other words, it could go either way, or either of the two ways, and it is two-tailed. Going back to our diagram, we can see how the independent variable age group explains and/or predicts the dependent variable consumption of calories per day. Here is another example to help us understand the independent and dependent variable. In this hypothesis, the researcher is conducting a study about the fear of violent crime. Individuals who watch violent films will report significantly higher fear of violent crime than those who watch nonviolent films. The dependent variable is fear of violent crime. The independent variable is film exposure, violent versus not violent. Going back to our diagram, we see how the independent variable of film exposure explains and predicts the dependent variable reported fear of violent crime. Of course, these examples raise important questions about measurement. We have identified our dependent variable as the reported fear of violent crime. The researcher would also have to determine how to measure this dependent variable. And this could be done in a number of ways. The researcher might have the individuals complete a survey where the subjects indicate their reported level of fear, or the researcher might find some other way to measure fear, such as indexing current events or other aspects of the context. The researcher would also have to manipulate the independent variable. This is where the researcher would manipulate, which means handle or control, the subjects into two groups, those who watch violent films and those who do not. If a researcher was conducting an experiment, the researcher could decide to show the subjects these films. Or perhaps the researcher was conducting a survey. The researcher might have subjects identify their levels of exposure to watching violent films and then put them into two groups. The violent film exposure group, where there was high indication of violent film exposure, and the other group, the nonviolent film exposure group, where maybe none or very infrequent watching of violent film occurred. Notice that these are not two independent variables, but two groups that are within the single independent variable called film exposure. The decision about measuring dependent variables and grouping on the independent is always left up to the researcher. And as you can see, there are a number of ways to do this. So far, we have identified two examples of different tests. So far, we have identified two examples of difference tests. We looked at the differences between adults and children in their calorie consumption per day, and in the second example, we looked at the difference in reported fear of violent crime according to violent film and nonviolent film exposure. Notice that in both of these examples of difference testing, there was the presence of a categorical independent variable. By this, we mean that the researcher manipulated the independent variable by forming groups. For difference testing, this makes sense because if you are looking for differences in the dependent variable, you would have to compare groups to find that difference. Now let's examine two more examples of the independent and dependent variable and how they operate in the context of relationship testing. Even though this is a relationship test, our initial diagram has not changed. We are still looking at the independent variable and the dependent variable in terms of explaining and/or predicting. Here is a one-tailed hypothesis. Study hours will be a significant and positive predictor of test performance. Here we observe that the dependent variable is test performance. The independent variable is study hours. We have a one-tailed hypothesis because it is a specifically positive prediction. One question you might be wondering about is the differentiation between the words explain and predict. And the answer is that sometimes we're interested in explaining variables and sometimes we're interested in predicting. It will depend on a variety of factors, including your conclusions from the literature review, your confidence in previously reported results, the data levels you collect, and the particular test you intend to run on the data. The second example we will be looking at is another relationship test. Reported hours of sleep will be significantly and positively related to reported levels of happiness. You will notice that this particular hypothesis uses the word related. In this example, we are looking at a correlation. Consequently, it is not important to identify which one is the independent variable and which one is the dependent variable. Keep in mind that because this is a correlation, we are not able to determine a causal relationship. We can only predict that they are positively related. Remember that correlation does not equal causation. Our options are to predict that they are positively related, negatively related, or possibly unrelated. In our specific example, we believe they are positively related. Because there are no identified causes, we can't assign causation. We don't know that sleep makes an individual happier or that happier individuals sleep. We only know that they tend to move together as variables. So we predict out of that assumption that they are positively related or positively correlated. This means that when one variable goes up, the other tends to go up and vice versa, so that when one goes down, the other tends to go down. In this example, we can only explain how the variables are or are not related to each other, and that's why we call this type of inquiry a relationship test. In review, we've seen how the independent and dependent variable might operate in both the context of difference testing and also in relationship testing. Overall, we know that understanding this basic information leads to strong foundations in research. Our second topic today is to talk about the idea of ethics. Now, I want to take you back to a time in the United States where we started to do research, but we didn't have any rules in place, or at least very few. What I've done is I've identified two different breaches of ethics that are very different in nature, but they help us understand really the problems that occurred prior to our main legislation that happened in the 70s. So we take two examples today to examine specifically. The first study that we want to examine is the Tuskegee syphilis study. And this study involved a number of men, actually 399 men, that were recruited to participate in this study. Now, the researchers knew that these men had syphilis, and they were interested in looking at how the disease progressed. So this study began in 1932, and actually is one of our longest studies in that it ended in 1972. So when you think about this study, remember it's a 40-year study. We'll talk about that more specifically after we take a look at this clip that you can see now.
It was in 1932 that Lily Head's father Freddie was approached by a doctor from the US Public Health Service. He was working as a sharecropper in the small town of Tuskegee in Alabama.
They came and told him that he had what was they called bad blood, quotation mark, bad blood. So my father, being a conscientious person and health conscious, felt that the story that they were telling him, if you have the bad blood, we can work with you and we will help you to control it. So he joined up, as many of the men did. They felt that that was a pretty good deal. Here they were poor, uneducated, and you had professionals, the doctors, whom they felt were responsible and liable, and they had placed all their trust in them. They were looking to better their health and to better their conditions with.
But the doctors from the Public Health Service had no intention of helping the men get better. They didn't even explain that bad blood was actually the sexually transmitted disease of syphilis. Without their knowledge, the men were being enlisted in a medical study under the title Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male, to see what happened if syphilis sufferers were given no treatment for their illness.
They would visit the men, check their blood, and then after each test, the men were given lunch and they were told, if things were going well or if things wasn't going well, but which wasn't quite factual.
So they knew that they were involved in a medical study, they just didn't know what it was.
I don't know if they would have understood it as a medical study, but they knew that they were being tested because their blood was supposed to have been bad. There was just so much information that was not available to them, and they were not informed.
Doctors already knew in 1932 that if syphilis is left untreated, it can cause heart disease, strokes, dementia, or even death. But in Tuskegee, there was very little public knowledge or discussion of the disease.
So you can see in this study that 399 men were recruited to look at the progression of syphilis and how it actually over time resulted in death. Now, of course, there's so many parts to this study that don't work. The clip that you saw talked about informed consent, talked about the idea that none of that happened. Let's think a little more about the details involved in this study. Now, the study began in 1932, and in 1932, they knew that this disease ended in death. And only about 8 years later did we discover penicillin. The very difficult reality of this study is that they chose not to give these subjects penicillin, even though it was a known treatment for syphilis by 1947. So if you think about it, this idea that between 1947 and 1972, this study was still being conducted withholding penicillin, even though it was known to be an effective treatment. Of course, that resulted in all sorts of additional bad problems. Women were getting infected, children were getting infected, individuals were dying. The researchers still persisted. Now you might ask the question, then why did it all stop in 1972? Well, it stopped when a guy named Peter Buxton, who was from the US Public Health Service, that's who was conducting the study, it stopped when Buxton said enough is enough. And what happened inside the organization is that they didn't stop it. So he went to the press. And when Buxton went to the press, then all of this came to light. And now we can fast forward to the 1970s, where all of a sudden the general public learns of this horrible study where individuals were harmed. And that is the biggest breach of all in terms of ethics.
You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
What I can't help but to think about in all of this is how much cover-up went on. Now, keep in mind the U.S. Public Health Service, that was the forerunner to the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control that we have today. So here's the health service conducting this study, withholding penicillin. The whole situation is horrible, and I'm wondering to myself, how many people saw these files? How many people didn't do something? Today we're talking about ethics. How many times did someone see that this was actually harming individuals and they made the conscious choice to not say something, to not do something about it? The next clip we're going to see is what happened much later when we see Bill Clinton apologizing for conducting the study on behalf of the United States, and this happened in 1997. So if you think about the time span here, it is a great time span in terms of research. And so let's take a look at that clip now.
The United States government did something that was wrong, deeply, profoundly, morally wrong. It was an outrage to our commitment to integrity and equality for all our citizens. To the survivors, to the wives and family members, the children and the grandchildren, I say what you know. No power on earth can give you back the lives lost, the pain suffered, the years of internal torment and anguish. What was done cannot be undone, but we can end the silence. We can stop turning our heads away. We can look at you in the eye and finally say, on behalf of the American people, what the United States government did was shameful, and I am sorry.
We can see from this clip that the beginning of the healing process started to happen in the late 1990s. 25 years after the conclusion of the Tuskegee test. Of course, this does help some, but you can see that in the 1970s, when all of this went public, there was a great need for regulation. And so we look to this as an example of not just human harm, which of course we're devastated with the people who were part of that study. We're devastated that the decisions were made. We're devastated that the secrecy occurred. But we also see it as an example of why regulation needs to happen. And that if individual researchers aren't going to follow a code of ethics that is common, then we needed to get some regulation in place. Of course, we know that this will help humans, and we know that the people who would have been helped in the Tuskegee syphilis study, we know that those men were uneducated. They were likely illiterate. They didn't have the ability to help themselves. So as we talk about the idea of ethics, of course, one of our main functions in doing that is to say, not just protecting humans, but the idea that you and I need to conduct ourselves ethically, especially for those who can't protect themselves. Now, our second example is another breach of ethics, but it's a very different one. It is the infamous Milgram experiments. And you may even have seen these experiments go on. They started in 1962. And Stanley Milgram, who was interested in social influence, really started a whole series of studies that began to look at human behavior in this special way. Let's take a look at some information about him.
Stanley Milgram, one of the most influential social psychologists of the time, was particularly fascinated with the dangers of group behavior and blind obedience to authority.
What is there in human nature that allows an individual to act without any restraints whatsoever, so that he can act inhumanely, harshly, severely, and in no way limited by feelings of compassion or conscience?
So Stanley Milgram's basic premise was the idea that we want to understand social influence. And as we start to try to understand social influence, he wanted to run an experiment that examined those variables specifically. So the Milgram experiment, the famous one we're talking about, was in 1962. And 40 men were recruited. They say 40 participants, but women and children weren't invited into this study. And they were invited to come into the laboratory and utilize what is known as the shock generator. Now, the shock generator was a series of dials that was in the laboratory, and the men who were participating had to shock the individual that they could hear in the other room. Let's take a look at some specifics about this investigation.
In 1962, Stanley Milgram shocked the world with his study on obedience. To test his theories, he invented an event that would become a window into human cruelty. In ascending order, a row of buttons marked the amount of voltage one person would inflict upon another. Milgram's original motive for the experiment was to understand the unthinkable. How the German people could permit the extermination of the Jews.
When I learn of incidents such as the massacre of millions of men, women, and children perpetrated by the Nazis in World War II, how is it possible, I ask myself, that ordinary people, who are courteous and decent in everyday life, can act callously, inhumanely, without any limitations of conscience? Now, there are some studies in my discipline, social psychology, that seem to provide a clue to this question. The problem I wanted to study was a little different. It went a little bit further. It was the issue of authority. Under what conditions would a person obey authority who commanded actions that went against conscience? These are exactly the questions that I wanted to investigate at Yale University.
It is May 1962. An experiment is being conducted in the Elegant Interaction Laboratory at Yale University. The subjects are 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50 residing in the greater New Haven area.
Psychologists have developed several theories to explain how people learn. One theory is that people learn things correctly whenever they get punished for making a mistake.
40 years later, Milgram's infamous experiment, obedience, is still taught in classrooms around the world.
Would you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. Learn. All right, now the next thing we'll have to do is set the learner up so that he can get some sort of punishment.
What inspired Milgram, I would say there were a number of factors. One of them is he was very ambitious. He wanted to make a mark in social psychology. And he wanted, as he wrote to one friend, he wanted to come up with the boldest experiment that he could think of.
Would you roll up your right sleeve, please? This electrode is connected to the shock generator in the next room. And this electrode paste is to provide a good contact to avoid any blister or burn. Do you have any questions now before we go into the next room?
About 2 years ago, I was at the Veterans Hospital in West Haven. And while there, they detected a heart condition. It was nothing serious, but as long as I'm having these shocks, how strong are they? How dangerous are they?
Well, no, although they may be painful, they're not dangerous. Anything else?
No, that's all.
All right, teacher, would you take the test and be seated in front of the shock generator, please, in the next room?
But the experiment was rigged.
The victim was an accomplice of the experiment. The victim, according to plan, provided many wrong answers. His verbal responses were standardized on tape, and each protest was coordinated to a particular voltage level on the shock generator.
Now, as teacher, you were seated in front of this impressive-looking instrument, the shock generator. Its essential feature is a line of switches that goes from 15 volts to 450 volts, and a set of verbal designations that goes from slight shock to moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and finally XXX, danger severe shock. Your job, the experimenter explains to you, is a word pair test. If he gets each answer correctly, fine, you move on to the next pair. But if he makes a mistake, you are instructed to give him an electric shock, starting with 15 volts. And you increase the shock one step on each error.
Incorrect. You'll now get a shock of 105.
hard head. Just how far can you go in this thing?
As far as is necessary.
What do you mean as far as is that?
Milgram was very much aware that obedience is a necessary ingredient for society to function. But he focused on the darker side of obedience.
Incorrect. 150 volts. Sad face.
Wait a minute. That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now.
It's absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice, teacher.
Oh, I have a lot of choices. My number one choice is that I wouldn't go on if I thought he was being harmed.
Now this man makes disobedience seem a very rational and simple deed. Now other subjects respond quite differently to the experimenter's authority.
Wrong. It's hair. 75 volts, Jim. You don't know that.
Please continue.
Some psychologists were troubled by the ethics of it. Many, if not most subjects, found it a highly stressful, conflicted experience. People are stammering, stuttering, laughing hysterically and inappropriately.
150 volts.
Experiment. That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now. Get me out of here, please. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let
Go
me
on.
out. Let me out.
Clearly, when we say people went to the top of the chalkboard, it wasn't like they were going blithely, sadistically. People went stop and go, stop and go. They were in a state of conflict, which created a tremendous amount of stress. So that was the main critique.
This will be at 3:30.
As we can see in this clip, those who were working on the shock generator believed that they were actually delivering the shock. The reality is that they weren't, but just the distress of believing that they were doing that to another human created all sorts of complications. Some of the individuals started crying. One of the individuals had a seizure. The stress was very, very high on those who were delivering the shocks. So what may surprise you is that this was before the idea of debriefing. So not only did they have that psychological distress, they left the laboratory with that stress. So let's take a look at a reflection back from one of those participants many years later.
As his voice began to show increasing frustration, so did I. And I was really in a state of real conflict and agitation. One of Stanley Milgram's basic contributions was that you don't ask people what they would do given this hypothetical situation. You put them in the situation.
Wrong. I'm up to 180 volts.
Please continue, teacher.
180 volts.
I can't stand the pain. Let me out of here.
Stand it out. I'm not going to kill that man there.
According to Milgram, one of the things that's a prerequisite for carrying out acts that are evil is to shed responsibility from your shoulders and hand it over to the person in charge.
I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
Next one's slow.
He didn't hold any gun to anybody's head. Just the fact that he conveyed a sense of authority. Roughly 60-65% of the people went all the way to the top of the shock board.
450 volts. That's it.
Now continue using the last switch on the board, please. The 450 switch for each wrong answer. Continue, please.
I'm not getting no answer. Don't the man's health mean anything?
Whether the learner likes it or not, we
But
must...
he might be dead in there.
Milgram made the point, I think very effectively, that the Nazis weren't all a bunch of psychopaths at Belsen and Dachau. A death camp from the middle class in New Haven.
Well, who was actually pushing the switch?
I was. But he kept insisting. I told him no, but he said he's got to keep going.
What kind of obedience would Milgram get today if he were to do the experiment today?
Probably about the same.
Probably about the same. Why?
After decades of research with no rules, you can see that these two examples provide us with a lot of reasons why we would need some legislation. So the Tuskegee experiment, the Milgram experiment, your book has so many other experiments in it that it refers to the idea that we needed some rules to help protect other people. And so in 1974 came the first set of important legislation, and that was when the U.S. passed the National Research Act of 1974. And this was the first time that we used the term human subjects. we put the word subjects in front of the word human. And when we did that, we started to acknowledge that we needed to protect other people. The next set of legislation happened in 1979. This was the Belmont Report. The result of this new legislation was that we had new rules about three important areas. One was human subjects, another about informed consent, the idea that we had to actually get consent from individuals before they participated in studies, and then finally that we had to look into the area of deception. And we would need to go through processes of protecting people's privacy and also using something called debriefing, something we know commonly today. Ultimately, there is a standard called the Common Rule, and that is what operates today. That's sort of the informal name for these standards. And this helps us understand the notion of risk and also minimal damage to subjects or minimal impact to human subjects. These collective policies end up translating into these institutional governing boards called the IRB, the Institutional Review Board. Now, most every public institution has this. And this IRB is what is used to clear research projects on any kind of college campus or for any organization. And it is comprised of a number of special members who can take a look at the proposal for research and then they can approve it for happening or not happening. Once the researcher gets that approval, then he or she is able to move forward. In other words, you have to have the IRB approval to be able to collect research. These sets of legislations in total have made it so that we have special steps we take rather than simply just having a great idea and getting people into a laboratory.
You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
As we look at these examples of ethics violations, of course, it reminds us of how careful we have to be in the process. Now we're going to turn our attention to two other parts of technical areas of research. Once we get that approval from the IRB, once we're able to be cleared to go and do our research, then we can start by building our hypotheses and research questions. And that's going to be the next section of what we talk about now. After you've completed your review of literature, you will need to determine your research questions and/or hypotheses. And this decision depends on what variables you intend to measure, as well as what you know about these variables based on your research. Given the research, are you going to ask a question about a variable, or are you going to make a prediction? As you make this decision, you will notice that research questions and hypotheses differ in terms of their structure as well as level of prediction. The first dimension is structure. Very simply, a research question is phrased as a question. A hypothesis is phrased as a statement. The second dimension is prediction. Are you making a prediction, yes or no? Now that we know the available choices in terms of structure and prediction, let's examine all four of these options, two types of research questions and two types of hypotheses. Let's start with research questions. There are two types of research questions, directional and non-directional. Both are phrased as questions. A directional research question makes a prediction, while a non-directional question does not. An example will help us understand the difference between these two types. A directional research question sounds like this: are children significantly more talkative than adults? Here you can see directionality is predicted in how the question is phrased. The question phrasing reflects the researcher's guess that children will be more talkative, and the word more makes this apparent. A non-directional research question would sound like this: will children and adults differ significantly in their talkativity? As you can see that in a non-directional research question, there is no directionality indicated. The question phrasing reflects the researcher's openness to either group being more or less talkative. The word differ makes this apparent. Now let's discuss hypotheses. There are two types of hypotheses, one-tailed and two-tailed. Both are phrased as statements. You can see that in a non-directional research question, there is no directionality indicated. The question phrasing reflects the researcher's openness to either group being more or less talkative. The word differ makes this apparent. Now let's discuss hypotheses. There are two types of hypotheses, one-tailed and two-tailed. Both are phrased as statements. A one-tailed hypothesis makes a specific prediction, while a two-tailed hypothesis makes a prediction but not a specific one. An example will help us understand the difference between these two types. A one-tailed hypothesis sounds like this: children will be more talkative than adults. Here you can see directionality is predicted in how the hypothesis is phrased. The hypothesis phrasing reflects the researcher's prediction that children will be more talkative, and the word more makes this obvious. A two-tailed hypothesis sounds like this: children and adults will differ significantly in their talkativity. You can also see that in this two-tailed hypothesis, there is not a specific directionality indicated. There is a predicted difference, but it doesn't specify which group will be higher or lower. The word differ makes this apparent. As we put this understanding together, we can see that all four types can be differentiated looking at the structure as well as the specificity of the prediction. Let's review a few examples to make sure we can identify each of these types. Example number 1. Married individuals will engage in conflict significantly less frequently than those not married. To identify what this is, we first look at the structure. You notice that it is a statement and therefore determine it's a hypothesis. Second, you examine the prediction and notice that it is making a prediction using the word less and therefore is a one-tailed hypothesis. Our second example is, will married individuals engage in conflict significantly more often than those not married? What is the answer? First, you look at the structure and you notice that it is a question and therefore determine it's a research question. Second, you examine whether it predicts and you notice it does make a prediction using the word more. Therefore, it is a directional research question. Our third example is this: students will differ significantly in the number of questions they ask compared to teachers. You may be asking, which type is this? Well, first, we look at the structure, and if you do that, you notice it's a statement and therefore determine it's a hypothesis. Second, you examine whether it predicts, and you notice it does not make a specific prediction and therefore is a two-tailed hypothesis. Our final example is this one: will students differ significantly in their frequency of asking questions compared to teachers? Which one is this? First, you look at the structure, and you notice that it is phrased as a question. Second, you examine whether it predicts, and you notice it does not make a prediction, and it is therefore a non-directional research question. So we've seen how structure and prediction really help us understand the four different types of formats that we could have in research. Now, one of the observations that you might make about this is the idea that they really are different in terms of boldness. In fact, our one-tailed hypothesis is the boldest of all, and our non-directional research question, then, the least bold. Some of that decision really depends on the research you're conducting. Of course, the task is for you to do the research and then decide how bold you really want to be. Now, as we have this discussion, of course, all of this is important as we put it into practice.
You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
For the last part of this show, we want to bring on a special guest, Dr. Claudia Lum. And I've invited her onto the show because I want us to talk about this idea of the scientific method. She is a science educator, and we have her on Skype for our interview now. Claudia, welcome to our program.
Hi, Dr. Kreiser.
Glad to have you on board. So I know you do science education, and I know that that's a big part of your background. What we are hoping to talk about today is this idea of the scientific method, and to hear kind of from you some basics about it. So why don't we start with, what is the scientific method?
Sure. The scientific method is the systematic, unbiased approach for finding answers to questions that we have. It is our universal method that we use by social scientists and by our hard scientists to prove and disprove explanations, make generalizations, confirm theories, gain knowledge, and ultimately help us inform policy and practice. It's an extremely organized and rigorous process, and it's been done since the 17th century.
Okay, so what I hear you saying is that the emphasis is on this organized, systematic process. I know that how it's implemented in hard sciences is a little bit different than social science, but the idea is that it's systematic. How does it work, like for our purposes, as we look at its implementation?
Sure. You know, it is very organized and orderly. So we usually start out with an observation or a set of observations that we notice about something. And scientists, sometimes they come in patterns, but it's something that's happening consistently over time. So for example, I'll take something that maybe people might know about in sciences, if you've had high school science. Pollinating 2 tall pea plants, right, seems to create more tall pea plants, okay? So that's an observation that we have made consistently over time, okay, if we were a scientist. Then the scientist would say, so I'm thinking that my hypothesis or educated guess about what is going on is that when we pollinate tall with tall, we're going to get tall pea plants. Okay, this sounds really simple right now, but just for people to understand what this is like. So then what the scientist does is he or she creates an experiment or does testing of some sort. It looks different in the social sciences to the hard sciences, but in this case, we're creating a set of experiments, and everything is extremely controlled, right? So the environment is controlled. There's no contamination. The plants, as you breed them, all of that process is controlled. There really are clean, careful guidelines for this process, strict measurements, same amount of water, same amount of time that we're pollinating during the plant growth process. You name it, the scientists control all the variables except for the growth of these plants, okay? And that's super rigorous. It's not to be taken lightly. This is an example with plants, but we use scientific method a lot, particularly in medicine, and you know, the rigor gets even more complicated.
And it's complicated because of the controls, or?
Yeah, it's complicated because there are variables that you have to control, and letting in particular variables, right, causes potential errors that would skew the experiment. Okay.
So the more the other variables that could be involved, the more likely that error could be something that is worrisome to the researcher?
That's right, because then you're not testing what you're actually testing, your actual hypothesis. The hypothesis is super clear cut, and you don't want to have any other thing in the way of answering that particular question in an unbiased way.
Okay. So is that what I'm hearing when you talk about this idea of unbiased? Am I hearing that that's what you kind of get with the scientific method? That you, because it's so organized and systematic, is that how we get rid of the bias? Because I know that hard science and social science struggles with that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, and the social science is definitely a different beast, right? Because you're dealing with people. And but even if you think about like Dr. Jenner, remember when he was doing the cowpox and smallpox, and he was trying to determine, he kind of found a correlation between people who got cowpox and then those people did not get smallpox, right? And in that experiment, it turns out that at that time, I'm going to say maybe 1800s, the people were fairly homogeneous. They were not able to move within and around the area. There was no traveling, right? I mean, we're traveling on buggies, right? And diet was similar. There wasn't anything that was engineered.
Right.
Okay, I'm going to bring in all these sorts of variables that we have now when we really talk about controlling the variables. so that bias does not occur to try to answer a question. That's a really good example, if you want to look at that later on, as to how it almost was perfect because it was such a long time ago. We didn't have all of those other things that we would have to account for now that would bias our study.
That's very interesting. So then one of the thoughts that occurs to me is in a mobile society, a society that has so much travel, so much ability to go all over the world, to see lots of different people, all these different things, that seems like all of a sudden, if we talk about bias, that we have, or lack of control, we have introduced all kinds of factors just on the baseline, so to speak.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you almost have to, it makes things more complicated, at least in the scientific field, it makes it more difficult. So more studies, creating a very randomized, controlled experiment, right? Again, I know you'll talk about this in your class, but just adds to the complexity of controlling the study. But it's not anything to be taken lightly, actually. When students do their research, it's really important that they really try to unbias their research at the testing level when they design their experiment or whatever they plan on doing, and at the analysis level, right? So there's multiple ways of creating error, but I know you'll get to that in your class.
Indeed.
You'll get to that in your class.
So it's important because of that. Is that what you would say, that that's the primary contribution? Is that idea of control and getting the bias out, or do you believe there's something we're missing?
No, I mean, I do believe that's what we're trying to do, is controlling the variables so that when you do your study, you're only focused on one question.
So let's talk for a second about any other applications. We talked about some hard science examples. You and I have talked about some social science examples. Other thoughts that you would say we could talk about that are examples in our society that might be useful to see in the social science or in social programs?
Yeah, I definitely would love to talk to you about a program that probably a lot of people know, that was actually super successful, but turns out, and we spent a lot of money on it, but it ended up being a program that was wrought with some validity issues. So this is the DARE program.
Okay.
DARE stands for Drug Abuse Resistance Education Program. It was a large-scale program started in 1983, done in the upper elementary and middle schools with the LA Unified School District and LAPD Chief Daryl Gates. I don't know if you remember. It was a great program. It was a feel-good program. It was a noble program trying to prevent the use of controlled drugs, among other things, but among juveniles. And if you remember, there was the Just Say No. Students, what they would do is they signed a pledge saying that they were not going to use drugs or join gangs, because that was a part of the among other things. But it was particularly students will not use drugs. And the local police came and did a 10-week program with them, which to prep that took 80 hours of training for the police officer, 40 hours for the teacher, and at the end of the program, they collected data. Okay, so the whole idea, students weren't going to use drugs. And at the end of the program, they collected a survey and students weren't doing drugs. So this program was super successful. And it was so successful that Nancy Reagan even pushed for DARE in schools. Okay, I mean, I think this program probably lasted for almost 20 years. So, and this is why I say, why is scientific method so important? Why is the use of it so important? So because it was so successful, actual scientific research using the scientific method, right, was done on DARE. And they use randomized controlled experiments, long-term studies, okay, to try to see, wow, what is it, right? Is this working, right? And wanting to record the data, okay, and wanting to get this out so we could get more policy, more money, more implementation. So there was tons of research done. Indiana University, 1992, that's when it started. California Department of Ed, 1995. The NIJ, National Institutes of Justice, 1998. The American Psychological Association, 1999. Unbelievable amount of research that was done, from long-term studies to just the randomized controlled experiments. They pulled so much research just on DARE. And it turns out that after all of this was done, every single report found that DARE was ineffective in reducing drug use. In fact, some of those studies of groups that I had mentioned to you before showed an increased likelihood of subjects to drink alcohol, smoke tobacco, and use illegal drugs. It was very interesting because one of the studies even found that by exposing impressionable children to drug use, it encouraged drug use.
Okay.
And who would have thought, you see?
Right.
So at the very end, over $200 to $700 million in total was spent on DARE over 20 plus years. I mean, in 2002 to 2010 is sort of when they started ratcheting it down, because the haphazard research that was going on, that had gone on because of DARE, right, was countered and fraught with problems, but found through the scientific method of the research that was done by these other groups. And they just found lots of issues with validity, reliability, bias, implementation bias. Some of the groups are counterproductive. Some of the populations that they tested were counterproductive in this whole process anyways, right, the population itself. How about gathering truth in front of the parents through surveys, right, that students weren't being honest about drug use?
Right.
So all of that the methodology was flawed, the analysis was flawed, and so at the very end, we spent so much money and so much time and effort for a program that didn't help at all. And the funny thing that's, I think, is interesting about all of this is, which is what scientists struggle with today and researchers, is even after we've disproved DARE, police, teachers, community leaders still promoted it. They still promoted it because in their heart and in small experiences, it helped. And so the funny thing is, even with this rigorous methodology, sometimes the research didn't even change the practice.
Yeah.
Which I think that is interesting that that I'm sure that you'll be talking about in your class too.
Yeah.
Because that is sometimes what researchers struggle to do now, is to take the findings of their unbiased research and bring it into practice.
So that
Right.
kind of leads me to a pretty interesting follow-up question, and that is, should we be introducing programs and immediately starting with scientific approaches, like scientific method analyses, very systematic examinations of these ideas before we put them into practice? I mean, which comes first? Like, I understand the idea of DARE, and it's a great idea, and we love the proposition behind it. My question is, how do we remedy that, I guess, looking back? Like, what have we learned?
I mean, a lot of times when we do scientific research, we do, I guess we call them, when I say observations, a lot of times those are practice go-arounds. Those are generalizations. Those are ideas that are sitting with us for a little while. It's not just one time that we find something, right? I mean, as scientists go through and find things about our world, those theories that they continue to either prove or maybe disprove, those are the same theories that we continually try to look at, right? And so those are theories for a reason. They've been around for a long time, right? And so they're called theories. In fact, sometimes we don't use the word facts because, there are things that are called facts, but theories can be changed. And so I feel in the same way, social science, don't you think? I think they made a generalization. They came up with an explanation, right, about something that happened, and then they used it to create a program. Well, I think it was too early.
It's interesting to me that we have this notion that, so they thought DARE was a great idea, then in retrospect do all the experiments to find out that it doesn't work, and then you're saying their bias wanting to believe that it works ends up their keeping of the program, which is very, very interesting because it sort of invalidates both of the processes, the implementation originally and then also the accompanying scientific explanation, right? Which is, I find that kind of interesting because when we talk about bias in quantitative and these method areas, we often are tagging the researcher on that, but here we're kind of tagging like the public and the funding agents and the agencies to say their bias was so strong about this notion that it actually gave them lenses to where they couldn't see the results, so to speak?
Yeah, and that's interesting. Unfortunately, I think that happens a lot, and maybe for political reasons, maybe, like I said, because it's personal. People really got involved with DARE, and it was a personal experience. And how can police officers and teachers working together with kids not be a good thing? I mean, I think, in education, those kinds of things are positive things. But we can't step out and say, this causes this, unless we've done unbiased research.
Right. So then,
we can't.
Do we have that answer then? Do we have the answer to DARE now today in your knowledge? I don't have that knowledge, but have we figured out how to reduce drug use and reporting of drug use and saying no and all these different things? Have we solved that puzzle, Claudia?
I think there has been tons more research done in this area about juvenile drug abuse. I know that there's research out there. I'd have to look into it.
Yeah.
And certainly, but I do know that but better research has been done.
Right.
But I think, and it's also what we tell our kids too, when we're looking at the internet and they're studying about things, is what do you believe when you're reading something and you're trying to get non-biased information, right? Trying to get factual information. What do you believe when you see things on the internet? We still see all sorts of things that are controlled by political groups, that are controlled by groups that still believe it. Religious could be, right? There's many different ways in which people run how they do things, right, in their lives. So, but as far as the research that you're talking about and what we want our students to do, when they do their own research, they have to know that this scientific method process is not haphazard. It is extremely organized, systematic. It's done the same way across the sciences and in all parts of the world, right? This is a universal methodology. It has multiple checks and balances. Students who do qualitative research will find that they're going to do multiple types of ways to gather data, multiple ways to analyze the data. It's just, I think the whole process, and in the end, it's based on how scientists think. So we use it because of that strength, and whatever we find helps to as I heard someone say, define us, explain our world.
Yeah.
Right? Help us understand a little bit more. And maybe disprove what we once thought, like the world is not flat. Right?
Right.
So, but you got to follow the rules of engagement. That would be my last comment for you when you do scientific method research.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lum, for coming on the show today. We appreciate your input, and we look forward to talking to you again in the future.
Oh, no, no problem. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Okay, have a great day.
Thank you.
You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
So in review, we've talked about a lot of different topics today. We began our discussion talking about independent and dependent variables, the foundations of what it means to be strong in our research. We also talked about ethics and the importance of having rules to regulate the decisions we make, in fact, even the inquiries we make in terms of research. And then lastly, we talked about hypotheses and research questions. And as we examined that, we saw how really specific those areas are, and we understand the 4 different types that exist for us to select. After we talked about that, we met with Dr. Claudia Lum, and we had a chance to hear from her regarding how we put all of this into practice. And of course, as we review all of these things, we can see the importance of control, of treatment of humans, in fact, some strong indicators of the ethics that you and I have to have when we're conducting research.